Hi there, Melissa Morris, founder and lead consultant at Agency Authority. I help busy, overwhelmed agency owners maximize their team, increase productivity, so ultimately they can increase profits and start scaling again. I have with me today my friend and the co-founder of Parakeeto, Marcel Petitpas. I said it right?
You
Yeah?
got it. Yeah,
I
you
got
did.
it. I got it. I was practicing. Marcel, you want to take a quick minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Marcel Petitpas. I'm the founder of a company called Parakeeto, and we specialize in helping digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability and essentially take over this job that doesn't have a name, which involves bringing together all the metrics from finance and operations and sales to figure out what's happening in the business and why and make better decisions every day.
So good. So, time tracking is a very hot topic with all of my agency owners. I'm sure you hear a lot of this as well. And so, it's something I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, and I knew I wanted to continue that conversation and discuss how it impacts team agencies overall. And I knew you were the guy I wanted to bring on and share that conversation with. So, last week I talked about why. Why do agency owners time track? Why should they? Where is the value in that? So if you missed that, let me know. Just drop save time in the comments. We'll make sure you got that. But now let's say, okay, we see the value. We get it. We're an agency, right? This is something we want to do, but it can feel a little daunting, a little overwhelming, especially the team component. How are we getting them on board? So I'd love to just start the conversation with how do you create and set realistic time tracking goals for your agency?
Hmm. So I think the first thing to understand is, to your point earlier, what is the purpose of time tracking? And I think that there are a lot of people that have been trying to make it seem like time tracking is bad, especially over the last couple of decades. And when I double click on who those people are and what their position is, where they're coming from, there's two very common threads. I very rarely see an argument against time tracking that isn't coupled to one of these two ideas. The first idea is time and materials billing. So people are saying, oh, time tracking is bad because billing clients for time is bad. And so it creates an intrinsic link between those things. So let's first understand that time tracking is not billing for time. Those two things are not intrinsically linked, they are independent of one another. We'll come back to that. The second big idea that this tends to be coupled with is something to the effect of basically the context of you're a solo freelancer, and so therefore it doesn't matter how much time you're spending on stuff. And again, that tends to delve into this concept of, billing for time. And then the last argument is, well, it's not going to be precise, therefore it will never be accurate, which I think is also a conflation. Precision and accuracy are also not the same thing, and therefore they should not be coupled. So let's separate those ideas. Let's understand first and foremost that time tracking is not using timesheets. It's not billing for time. And it's not trying to develop a minute by minute, very, very precise, very specific record of where everyone's time is going. And it doesn't even necessarily, in order to be very useful to an agency, need to look at non billable time or non client time, right? The main purpose of this exercise is to create a model of where time is going so that we can understand our margins, our costs, what's taking longer than expected, what the expectations should be around things like resource planning and, how much we resource people against certain types of work, or what we're selling things for. And I think the best analogy I can come up with here is, if we were in a restaurant and we did not know how much our food costs and our dishes, that would seem to be a very irresponsible way to run a restaurant. And that is exactly what firm owners do when they run their firm without understanding where their time is going. The reality is, our largest variable cost is time. It's what we buy from our team. It's what we resell to our clients, even if we don't sell it directly as time and materials. And so we should understand where it's going, because if we don't, we have a very, very limited lens into what's happening in the business. And therefore, we can't do a good job of running the business, which is bad for everyone involved. So this is me not answering your question, but starting with kind of like a broad rant of like, what is this about? Because I think that framing is really important before we dive into, what's a reasonable objective for time tracking in the business. And from my perspective, the baseline is anyone that does work for clients tracks the time spent against clients. That's it. Everything above that is, you know, potentially a point of diminishing returns. And if you're in a position where you're not tracking time or you've struggled to track time, that's the starting point. And it is the 80-20 in terms of the lowest level of effort with the highest amount of return.
I think you made some really amazing points, and I'm so glad you brought up. I'm glad you did your rant because there was some really valuable things I want to circle back to in there. I agree. I always tell agency owners when they come to me, and the first thing I ask them is, "Are you tracking their time?" "Oh, we're not time and materials. We're flat rate or project." That's cool, but are you tracking your time? Because how can you possibly know if you're charging effectively, if you're getting out of scope, taking like so much information can come from tracking your time and knowing that it matches up against that. And I love that you brought up this argument about, well, it's not going to be perfect, it's not going to be accurate. And the truth is, when we're looking at a lot of our marketing data points, the same could be said there. Like if we're looking at an open rate on emails, there are some where there's a program that's going to automatically open it. Maybe an assistant opens it and it doesn't get in front of the person you want it to get in front of. There's always these little nuances, but what you're looking for are trends, right? Like if I'm looking across the board at my open rate over months or, you know, getting to the point where it's years, I'm going to notice spikes, dips, peaks, valleys along the way. And it sounds like you're in agreement that this is what we're looking for in our time too.
It's that, and it's also, you have to consider materiality, right? So I'll give you an example. If I'm wondering like, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Because I need to decide what to wear.
Mm-hmm.
You know, knowing that it's going to be between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or it's going to be between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, has a material impact on the decision that I'm going to make. Right. And so even that, I think, is a concept in of itself, is that we don't need a precise measurement. So I don't need to know it's going to be 73.42 degrees to know roughly what I'm going to wear, what decision I'm going to make. I just need some kind of a range. And even if that range has, you know, error bars around it or a set of probabilities around it, that is still helping me inform directionally accurate decisions. And it's still helping me identify material gaps between my expectations about what's happening in my business and what's actually happening in my business. And when we really boil operations in any kind of professional services firm down, it's a function of taking assumptions about people, projects, and time, projecting them out into the future, and then basically planning against that. And so our degree to scale and do good job of operations is directly correlated to our ability to make good assumptions. So, you know, doesn't it make sense that we should have a feedback loop that tells us when those assumptions are wildly out of line with reality, which you and I both know, working with firms, happens pretty often, actually.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And those first 2 months of time tracking are often very enlightening for agency owners and the team, right?
Even when they're not precise, right? Even when they're not
Even,
precise,
yes.
we still get good insight.
Yes, absolutely. So as we're rolling this out, we've decided, you know, we see the value and we want to adopt this as a team. How do we make sure team members see time tracking as a value add and not a to-do or maybe a way to get micromanaged or to work faster?
Yeah. I'll separate this answer into kind of two sides. One, which is like the fundamentals, and then we could talk about tactics. Because I think when we start talking about getting the team to do it, the conversation skews towards tactics, right? So let's find a better tool. Let's gamify it. Let's have a scoreboard. Let's use, you know, like, and I'll mention some people that have made some great apps like Time Jam. Awesome. Slack integration. It gamifies time tracking, puts people in teams. Like that's a great tactic. MemTime. Awesome. It puts an agent on people's computers and it tracks what they're doing and helps them fill in their timesheets, but doesn't share that information with anybody else. Awesome. Like great assistive tooling to help someone track time. But the fundamental issue that you're pointing to here is, do they actually care about this? And what is the story in the team's mind about the time tracking data? Why they're doing it, how it's being used, who's looking at it, what decisions they're making, what reflection or impact it has on them. And often that is where there is a miss and it causes issues regardless of how much we invest in the tools, the tactics, you know, the discipline, the, you know, whatever management tactics we use around that. So to me, the easiest way, I shouldn't say easy, the simplest way to correct for this is what I call closing the loop. So the decisions and conversations and reports that the time tracking informs should become visible to the team on a regular cadence so they can actually see what's happening with that information. Because it doesn't matter how much you tell them what's happening, unless they see it, they're not really going to internalize that. And the hang up or the pushback that I tend to get when I propose to an owner that they should do this, or to an executive team that they should do this, is they say it's a chicken and egg game, right? Well, I can't put the data in front of my team because the data is not good yet. But the data is not good because the team isn't bought into the time tracking. And so it's skewed. And so my argument is actually, no, that's exactly the reason you should put this data in front of the team, so they can see the impact that the bad data has on you. Right. So
Yeah.
let's run through an example of this. Let's say you're having a compliance issue. The team's not getting their time in. You meet with them and you go, hey guys, we're going to look at some reports together. This is our utilization rate and our client profitability. And I mean, I have great news. We were way under budget on every single client project. All of our clients are super thrilled. And it looks like we could go sell twice as much work next month, and you guys still wouldn't be that busy. How incredible is that? And then the team's going to go, well, hold on. All of our time might not have been submitted in the timesheets. We may have forgotten to put some of it in there. And then you can kind of play dumb and say, well, I'm so glad you told me that, because, you know, I could have gone and like booked you on way too much work, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that like we're not overworking you guys. So, you know, it's important that I have an accurate understanding of how long it's taking you guys to do these things, so, you know, we can plan for this better into the future. And then you might find that the pendulum swings the other way, where they start over reporting on time. Then you have the opposite discussion, like, hey guys, it looks like we're going over budget a lot on stuff. What are we missing about this? But if you close the loop and you just have discipline around having that conversation, eventually your team will start to understand that, assuming you're actually using the time this way, truthfulness is the best policy when it comes to time tracking data, and it benefits them to have the management team in the organization have an accurate understanding of what to expect and what to plan for into the future. It's really that
Yeah.
simple. So to me, like nothing is a substitute for actually just like closing that loop and getting the team involved in seeing, feeling, touching the impact that this data actually has on their day-to-day.
Yeah, I agree. And anytime I'm supporting an agency owner as we're implementing time tracking tools or rolling it out to the team, one of the first things I recommend is that they have a conversation with the team. And the conversation doesn't just get down into the tactics, like you said. Hey, this is the new time. We're using Harvest. You're going to track your time. This is your login. That has a time and its place, but also helping them understand why this matters to them. And I think the capacity example is a great one, right? Okay, I hear you, design team, telling me that you've got too much work, but our client load, the proposal, that like something is feeling out of alignment here, and I need to understand so that I can get you the support that you need, or we need to realign service offering, or whatever it starts to look like. But until I have some data to work with and have some points to move off of, it's hard as the agency owner to start making decisions like that when things don't feel in alignment. And so I think, you know, getting them on board with that early on, is that something you also recommend agency owners do, is have that conversation at the start with their team members?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. It should be clear upfront. Like, why are we doing this? What decisions is going to help us make? What kind of data is this going to help us calculate? And again, as quickly as possible, start closing that loop. The sooner you can do that, the better. Even if there's issues in the data, like that's actually the way that you work through it as a team. And then the other thing that I'll articulate here is the nuances are very important in terms of how that conversation happens, because you can do it the wrong way. And I'm sure we've both seen this, where if all of a sudden you start having that meeting turns into you reprimanding people for missing their utilization target, well, guess what's going to happen? People will magically start hitting their utilization target, no matter how much work there actually is to do. All of a sudden, you're going to start seeing budgets get blown over. You're going to start having people complain about how you're measuring utilization and start asking you if working on the company website can be considered billable time, and if we can start removing paid time off from their capacity, right? These are all massive problems because they actually, they put oil in the well. And they turn that data into something worse than having no data, which is having bad data that gives you false negatives and false positives, or in that give you this idea of knowing what's going on, but that's actually false, right? It's hallucinations about what's happening in the business. And so be very, very careful about how that conversation happens. And it should always be exactly what you just went through, very intuitively, a curiosity based conversation of like, here's what we're seeing. What can we learn from this? Why might this be? What might we do going forward to close this gap between what we expect and what's actually happening? And not a disciplinary conversation. And I think as early as you can be making that stuff clear, but then actually following it up with taking those actions, the better.
Yeah, and the hope there too is when we're coming with them with curiosity and questions is letting them know this is also an endeavor to support them and to help them, which I think it should be. I think that's part of the process, is to help the whole team.
And one thing I'll add to this too is one of the things that I've seen be successful, especially in firms where there's a lot of resistance to this idea, is it actually starts with using time tracking just in one specific area of the business as a tool to solve a specific problem. So you might find like, hey, there's a team within the agency that's like constantly working evenings and weekends and they're getting super burnt out. We have a lot of turnover there. You might go into that area of the business and say, hey guys, like this seems to be a problem. How might we figure this out? And of course, all roads in that conversation lead to, well, wouldn't it be helpful if we actually understood how much time to plan for on these things? Great. Okay. So why don't we just try like for like a couple of weeks measuring how long it takes us to do things. And then we can compare that to like what our assumptions are on the sales team and see like where the deltas are. And like build a use case and prove out like, hey, when used this way, this is actually pretty handy. Because I really fundamentally believe that if you structured a firm in such a way that all people were accountable to was gross margin or delivery margin, most teams would end up choosing to track time on their own because it benefits them. So you just have to think about it through that same lens.
Yeah, and it is just looking at it all through a different lens. So we've talked about rolling it out to the team, and you mentioned it, and I know I see it. Inevitably, there are a few team members who just routinely fail to accurately track their time. And this isn't, they understand the tech, they've been trained, they're just not complying. How do you go about addressing those team members?
So I think this is less of a conversation about time tracking. Frankly, it's just kind of a management of people 101 kind of conversation. So step one, is it a people problem or a process problem? So like let's really make sure we look at process and make sure that there's not something there that's truly getting in their way. They can't log into the tool, the projects aren't there, like maybe there is actually something fundamental, there's an accessibility challenge. Like we have to be open to exploring what those things are, and that's generally the first of the 2 or 3 performance conversations we're having with that individual. Hey Melissa, I noticed that your time isn't getting in on time. This is really important to the business. We've had this conversation. This is why we do it. This is how it's going to benefit you. Do you have any challenges with that? Is there anything that you need in order to meet this commitment? And can you commit to that thing? Yes, I can commit to that thing, but I don't know. I have a sensitivity with my site, and I need an app to track my time in that is monochromatic. Okay, great, no problem. Let's address that thing. If it happens again, we have that same conversation. And by the end of that second or third conversation, it's like, hey, this is not a negotiable thing. It's critical to the business. It's important that we be able to protect everybody in the organization by having accurate understanding where time's going. If you can't commit to doing this, then we're going to have to find you a different place to work where this isn't an expectation. And it's just kind of traditional people management. But I think the first thing to really double click on is like, is this actually a process problem? And in some cases, you might find that it is. Or that there's a misconception or there's a misunderstanding about what's going on. And if that doesn't get addressed after 2 or 3 cycles of performance management, then if this truly is important for your organization, it's something that you're committed to, and I believe that everybody should be committed to at least some way of modeling time, it should become a non-negotiable at that point.
Yeah, I saw Daniel had a question, and we're going to get to that in just a second. I just wanted to say I am in agreement that I typically see it becomes a people problem when it becomes egregious and excessive, the lacking of time tracking. Of course, like you said, assuming we have ticked the boxes and the capability is there, it's now more a lack of desire. And I have often found that a lot of times this person is not struggling just in time tracking within their role. There are typically other things going on, and in which case it does require a conversation and some touch points.
And we can talk a little bit too about like, on the process side, what are some things that I have seen get in people's way, if that's helpful?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the first thing is that, again, precision and accuracy being conflated the same thing. So there's a good chance that if you're asking your team to track time to like the nearest 5-minute increment on the subtask within a task, within a deliverable, within a milestone, within a phase, within a project, like that is probably too much. You're just going to have time tracking compliance issues with that. You also have to consider that there is like time that is spent directly on clients that's very easy to track. And then you're going to have certain roles like account and project managers where a lot of their day is going to go by in these little 5-minute increments, in email there, a quick Slack conversation with this client there, going in and updating 50 different clients in the project management tool within the span of an hour. And so I think it's important that you sit down and deeply consider, like, from an operational perspective, is what we're asking our team to do feasible? Another thing that you could consider exploring is moving away from timesheets if your organization is structured in such a way where people are not diluted across a lot of different projects at a time. In especially in companies that are building like big software or big, web apps, for example, where you might have like an engineer that's working on one client every day for like 6 straight weeks. A resource plan could actually be a better way to track time, because the one person in the organization that's likely to get on board with this and be excited about it, the project manager, they can now track time on behalf of their team just by maintaining a resource plan and capturing material changes to that. And on the balance of like $1 million 18-month project, rounding up by a few hours or even half days is just not that material. So like you still get an accurate read even though you're not being very precise. So consider operationally what's going on there and try to, at the very least, start very, very simple. Start with just requiring delivery time. And then the other thing is consider that integrating time tracking into the project management system is not always actually the best choice. I think there's a lot of people that just assume that that's going to be better no matter what. But in a lot of cases, there's actually a lot of trade-offs. And you would know this very well, Melissa, having done a lot of implementations in project management softwares, where sometimes that makes sense. But a lot of times there is now a trade-off where operations needs a certain data structure, but PM wants to set up the tool in a certain way. And now they're fighting over the object of like, well, we want to use the task list to correspond to the phase. But operations is like, no, we need the task list to correspond to this section in the contract. And now they're fighting over who gets to determine this. And every time something changes in one camp, there's now this intrinsic link between those two things. And so in a lot of cases, when you're just thinking about the design of the tools, you may want to actually just separate time tracking from project management or time tracking from some of these other workflows so that you can keep it very, very simple and then leave complexity in the places where it's actually appropriate. Like, for example, the way that tasks and subtasks are nested inside the project management tool, or the way that dependencies are created, or the way that task lists are organized, or what have you. So all of those things, from a process perspective, I think important to consider. And then lastly, just like, I do think that there's a lot of value while we're putting cherries on top of this, of like having a tool that looks nice, that people like to use, that people can use in a way that works for them. And so this is part of the reason I like Harvest. You can do it inside of a lot of apps. You can use a timer. You can use an iPhone app. You can use a Chrome extension. Like, there, you can just kind of put it wherever. And so there's a much higher likelihood that someone's going to find a way that works for them. And I do love, tools like MemTime, tools like TimeJam that help kind of add another layer of engagement to these things. And so I think those things are worth exploring once you get these other more fundamental things in place.
Yeah, we've migrated quite a few clients into Harvest, and they like it. And I do agree. People are often surprised to hear me say it. I can think in the 8 years I've been doing this, there's maybe been one time where I thought it made sense to go ahead and use the time tracking tool within the project management tool. Any other time, I recommend a different time tracking tool versus bundling up in your PM for all the reasons you shared. So we did have a question come in. I thought we could take a quick minute to look at that. So Daniel says, I run a traditional creative agency. Is there any value in having unbillable staff track time? I know it's helpful for determining things like burn rate, but if we already account for that in our hourly rate, is this something we need to enforce? Would love your thoughts.
Yeah, the baseline answer is no. Okay, so is there value? Yes, there's value. Does the value justify the cost? Almost never. That's the short answer. And so to unpack that a little bit more, the most important thing that I think should be a non-negotiable is time spent on client work should be measured. So we have an understanding of where it's going, so we can understand what our gross margins are on our clients and projects, so that we can make sure that our resource planning and estimates and pricing are all good. That is by far the highest point of leverage for time tracking. The argument for tracking internal time is typically one of a few things. Number one, well, how are we going to know what our utilization rates are if we're not tracking all the non-billable time? My rebuttal to that would be you're not tracking utilization rate properly, or you're using a way of doing it that is just like so operationally risky. Like you shouldn't be doing that. So like my biggest qualm with Harvest is the way it calculates utilization requires you to track 40 hours a week, because it looks at a percentage of time billed versus, not, which is like, okay, well, we know that that's never going to happen. So let's just not track utilization that way. The second reason that people might say this is because they're using a way of measuring their gross margins at the agency level that's tied to time, and they're doing salary allocations based on time, which I would argue is also just not the right way to do it. Do salary allocations based on people's roles, not based on time tracking, and measure the direct delivery margin of projects using time, but separate those two things. Like the profitability of the delivery department of the business is calculated differently than the profitability of an individual projects. And those things are not supposed to line up to each other. In fact, trying to do that is part of the problem. So just stop doing that. And then the third reason that people will often want to do this is because they want to make sure their team is busy. And that is like one of the reasons that you shouldn't be using time tracking for, because it's going to work against all the things that we talked about earlier. So from my perspective, it's like, it's a bonus. So at Parakeeto, this is our policy. Mandatory track time against clients. If you want to track time against other things because it's useful to you, or because we're deliberately doing a time study in a certain area of the business, great, but it's not required. That's our personal position, because again, the cost of that relative to the upside, which is very limited, it just doesn't add up. And there's very little that we can learn from that we can't also learn by just tracking delivery time exclusively and then having a higher level understanding of where the rest of that time is going. One last thing I'll mention is sometimes people will say, well, how are we going to know if we have a time tracking compliance issue if we don't track internal time? And my answer to that would be, if we have a solid forecast, we should still be able to identify time tracking compliance issues, because we'll be able to see material differences between what we expected to happen and what actually happened. And generally it'll be a material difference in terms of like, here's how many hours we had planned for this person to work, or we had planned to go into this project, and we spent considerably fewer hours than that. That would be a place where we would go double click, and often we'll be able to be on top of and address time tracking compliance issues, which again, don't require us to say, hey, everybody get your 40 hours a week in, no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach. And something I've seen too is where we have, and I'm curious your thoughts on this too, is I have seen where when we have internal categories, buckets, right, and our time tracking, it can start to feel like a catch-all or a way to fill and pad, like I use pad loosely, time. And then all of a sudden you're looking at someone's timesheet and you're like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
8 hours on admin time this week. Oh, 15 hours of back end work, right? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
Do you see that too, where having this can start to complicate your time tracking?
100%. Yeah. It's more complexity. It does become a catch-all. I mean, we see this all the time when we do audits with clients. We pull their time tracking data, and there's a bunch of time logged to clients, but also logged internally, or like there's a bunch of internal time, but then in the notes, it's like there's a client's name in it. And so
Yes.
this starts to get into the conflation of billable versus non-billable, and how are you defining those things? I mean, we could go way down the rabbit hole on this, but yes, I agree that like there actually are downside. There's a lot of downsides to tracking internal time. One of them being that you can create this place that people just go hide things. And again, unless there's a very specific outcome that you're trying to measure from an internal perspective, I would advise against enforcing that as a requirement in the business.
Yeah, that meeting, I think, is the one I see that is the most egregious. It is not uncommon at all where we see all this time spent on internal meetings. And then when you dig a little deeper, well, the copywriter and designer were talking for 45 minutes about a specific project. That's time to the client. You're brainstorming, you're, being creative, you're planning, like that's not internal time. That is time tracked to a project. So I see that one a lot. Okay. So we're time tracking, we're learning all the great ways to do it effectively, we're getting great data. Now what? What do we do with that data? What would you recommend as an agency? Maybe we've got a few months of data under our belt. What are some of those maybe first things we can look for to make good use of this effort?
So the purpose of all of this should be to basically do three things. Number one, get better at predicting the future. and number two, improving our profitability. All right, so let's talk about how those two things actually transpire, which will kind of inform how we might prioritize the things that we start reporting on with regards to time tracking data. If we think about how to improve the profitability of the business, that really comes down to three key data points. And I'm happy to share some resources that kind of go ad nauseum into the details of this
Great.
stuff. But there's basically three levers that improve the delivery margin or the gross margin of the business, which is the foundation. The first is average cost per hour. So that's understanding, across different areas of the business, what does an hour of labor cost us on average? And to the extent that we can decrease that, we end up basically decreasing how much we spend to earn our revenue. So that's an interesting vector to be looking at, is like, hey, there's certain types of work where our average cost per hour is way higher because we need much more senior or much more expensive people to do that kind of work versus these other things that don't. I would say that that's probably the last priority. The second thing that we would pay attention to in terms of improving profitability is utilization. So how much of our team's time that we're paying for ends up being used for doing things that earn us revenue, right? Working on client work so that we can complete deliverables, so that we can move that revenue from deferred revenue on the balance sheet to the profit and loss statement. I would say that that is like the second priority. And then the first priority, the thing that I would generally always start with, is average billable rate, which helps us understand for every hour that we spend, how much revenue do we earn as a business? And the nice thing about average billable rate is it doesn't care about your billing model. In fact, it normalizes all your billing models. So you might have something that's billed on percent of ad spend over here. You might have another thing that's a flat fee over here. You might have a thing over here that's hourly. Doesn't matter. The average billable rate formula is the same across all of those, which is how much did we get paid and how many hours did we spend doing the work, regardless of if they were billed to the client or not. And with that metric, we can start to really get interesting insights into, there's certain clients that we make a lot more money for every hour that we invest in them than others. There's certain services or certain products or even certain teams within the organization where there are material differences between how much time we spend and how much revenue we earn. And that can really start to help us understand a couple of important things. Number one, where are our assumptions way out of line with reality, where we spend a lot more or a lot less time than we expected? And what kind of things are actually driving really good profitability for the business? And where can we double down? Where do we need to focus our operational energy to like maybe close some of these gaps or maybe improve how much revenue we earn for each hour that we spend? So in terms of priority, I would probably start with that. Just start measuring your average billable rate, then layer on utilization. And I wouldn't expose utilization to the broader team. That's more of like a management metric and like a project management metric. And then the last rung in that ladder would be pay attention to average cost per hour. And that is the order in which I would generally be thinking about optimizing those things as well. And that should really kind of give you a solid baseline on the leading indicators to profit, and will also start to help you understand where are our assumptions way out of line with reality, so that all of the forecasting that you're inevitably doing will start to become more accurate over time as well.
Yeah, and I think that billable rate often feels elusive to a lot of agency owners, and it's coming down to the time tracking. Like once you have that data, it's really quite simple to start to extract that information and that data. You just need that time tracking bit. And I have seen agency owners where we're talking about one of their particular, oh, this is our biggest client, whatever they want, they get what they need. They make up a huge chunk of our income. Like we just have to serve them. Let's take a look at the data. We start looking at them. They are their least profitable client by like a landslide sometimes, just because that top line number feels big. It feels good on, right? You send that invoice, you're feeling good about that number. But when you actually look at the resources and time that are dedicated towards serving that project, that bottom number, though, when we get down to the profit number, starts getting really small.
Yeah. And this leads to a really important insight here, which is like, it's about quality of revenue over quantity of revenue. And you can't differentiate between those things if you don't understand what it's costing you to earn that revenue, which is time is the only way that I know to differentiate in a service business what that cost and investment is. So that's what makes this so important. There's another thing I want to layer onto this, which is, it comes back to one of the things we talked about earlier, which is people make this too complicated. They focus on precision, and it often comes at the cost of accuracy. What's going to make this exercise hard? So let's say, for example, you want to measure average billable rate by client. So what are the requirements to measure that? Well, number one is you need to understand how much that client paid you and how much of the money that they paid you is passed through. So things that flow through to other vendors. So for example, if you collect $100,000 a month from a client, but you spend 80,000 of that on Facebook ads, You need to understand those two things so that you know, okay, of that $100,000, we get to keep 20. That's our agency gross income. And then the other input that you need to understand is how much time did we spend? So if you think about this from just the metadata on a time entry, every time entry needs to have a client object on it. And that client object should be able to be tied back to how you were paid. Ideally, those naming conventions match up, but at the very least, you need to be able to like identify which client this is for on, our invoicing system, and which client this is for in our time tracking system. I know this like sounds really, really obvious, but in practice, we start digging into these things and we're like, why do the client names not match up to anything? Why are the project names different, right?
I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it.
These things matter. And this is what gets in the way, right? So that's easy. Where this gets, I think, a little bit more nuanced is, okay, you want to be able to compare different types of work, SEO versus websites versus brand design. Okay, well, if that's going to be structured data, now every time entry, or at least every project, needs an object that defines what type of service this is. Was this SEO? Was this website? Was this brand design? Those naming conventions need to be consistent as well, because what you don't want to end up doing is pulling time tracking data and having 17 different variations of each of those words. And all of that is friction. And people don't really think it's going to be that big of a deal. But when you have 5 dimensions that you now need to clean up before you ever get to a report, the report's not happening in the fast-paced agency environment. Like if it takes somebody an entire afternoon to clean up all the data to be able to give you what was our average billable rate by service line for the last 6 weeks, that report is not happening consistently. So you do have to put some thought into what is the structured data that we need from this, which is going to dictate how you set up the time tracking tool and what you need to be really militant about in terms of compliance, and what you can accept as being unstructured data, where you're not going to enforce it as tightly. You don't really care so much that it's going to be a little bit messy. You might have to clean it up, but that's okay because you might only ask that question of your data twice a year. And so it's actually less expensive to spend an extra hour cleaning up the data every time you want to answer that question versus having to carry that complexity around with you all the time. But keeping the data schema simple and making sure that it's structured to answer your most important questions that you set out to answer when you started this time tracking exercise in the first place is really important. And it's a step that I think a lot of people skip. They run right to, let's set up the time tracking tool. They skip this important step of saying, what question are we trying to answer? They then slide into this trap that everybody slides into, which is let's make this as complicated as we can possibly make it and start tracking everything. And in doing so, they end up tracking nothing, because when they pull that timesheet, it's such a fucking mess that they can't get anything from it. Excuse my French, but this is what we see, and it makes me emotional.
It is. I always say this. I see it not only in time tracking, but even in people's project management tools. There's almost like 2 camps. The camp where they were like, website, and you're like, oh, okay, well, what percentage of that was copywriting versus design versus whatever? Or it's like all the way down to like the homepage paragraph. I'm like, okay, like a whole task or a whole code in your project management tool for, copy for one page in the website. It's too much. And consistency, I agree. Consistency is key in getting that set up front. And so, I always recommend, and I'm sure you do too, is guarding who can create codes in the time tracking tool, who can set up the projects. And it's really just to protect the infrastructure of the integrity of the tool itself, so that you don't end up with copywriting, copy points, right? Like all these different variations that really just need to be in one code.
Yes, and there's also 2 sides to this issue. So, I mean, this is part of kind of the drum that we're banging at Parakeeto, which is to some degree you can control the inputs, and I think that is a good thing to do. But in some cases, you either can't, or the more you try, the worse your time tracking compliance gets, right? So, like that in and of itself starts to become a bit of a dichotomy. Yeah. So, one of the arguments that I'll make here is, it also behooves you to set up your reporting system in such a way that it doesn't matter that you end up with 15 different variations of the word design, because you can write data cleanup rules in your data pipeline that normalize all of those things. So that's like at Parakeeto, that's how we design these data systems, because what we've learned is we can't stop clients from messing this up. And also, even if you could be perfect about controlling the inputs, at some point they're probably going to change for a good reason, right?
That's
Maybe
true.
you'll change platforms, or you'll completely
Yeah.
restructure your teams, or you'll start changing the way that you set things up, or some other tool downstream will change, which will then impact how you use this tool, because the integration works in an idiosyncratic way and you can't connect this object to that object, so you have to use a new object to define the thing, right? So like these things happen, and
Yeah.
rather than pretending that they won't, or building a system that just completely breaks when those things occur, my recommendation is use an extract, transform, and load framework for doing reporting, so that that transform step allows you to handle those things more gracefully. So you can say,
Mm,
hey, if it used to be called UX design, well, transform that into the new thing that we're calling it, which is user experience design. And those two things are now normalized over time, and you don't end up with a seam in your reporting. So I think that's another thought, is like there's a certain amount of this that you can expect. And so build your system in such a way that it handles those things. And this is like part of why we do it that way at Parakeeto when we help clients set this stuff
yeah.
up.
Yeah, definitely. It's about giving like a container, but allowing for flexibility that is going to come with what agency life demands. And I think, like you said, allowing the person to feel like they're inputting really good data, but in some sort of
Yeah.
container that it feels like it lends itself to the bigger picture.
And that leads us to this other thing that, like, and I apologize if this is me getting on a soapbox, but I think it's a really interesting discussion, is, you know, it should be someone's job to be overseeing this whole system, because it's not static, right?
Yes.
People are going to randomly create new naming conventions in the
Hmm.
system. People are going to forget their timer is running while they're on holiday break and log a 176-hour time entry. People are going to log time to a project that ended a year and a half ago because they mistyped the name into the thing and they were half asleep when they were logging their time. These things are going to happen. Tools are going to change. Systems are going to change. New stakeholders are going to enter the organization to have different needs. And this is what I find really fascinating, is this is a job that either deliberately or doesn't deliberately exist, but somebody kind of has to do it in every organization, but we don't have a name for it. In bigger
Yeah.
organizations, it's called data operations. And there's millions of dollars being spent on data engineers and data scientists and all this crazy technology. And their whole job all day long is to like collect data from across the organization, clean it, transform it, normalize it, build reports, report to stakeholders, make sure that that whole system is being maintained. But when you have an agency of 25 people, it's usually just something that the ops manager is kind of doing off the side of their desk, either because they've been told to, or because they just kind of realized everything goes to shit if I'm not trying to do
Yeah.
something about this. So I would encourage everyone to like acknowledge that that's a job that someone needs to do, and then be deliberate about it and resource them with it and give them the purview to be able to catch these things and be involved in the conversations when things are changing. That way, you don't end up in this situation where change is seen as this bad thing that breaks everything and we're reacting to it. We can be proactive. If the
Right.
PM team says, hey, we need a new platform because this is not working anymore, let's get involved in that conversation and say, great, let's manage this successfully and in such a way that we don't go 4 months without reports because something broke and then we're playing catch up to try and fix it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was thinking too, is there's a person, a team, a couple of people, somebody who is ultimately the guardian of the time tracking tool to make sure things stay on track and in alignment, and that they do feel empowered to reach out to team members like, hey, you're time tracking, or you're failing on the compliance side of things. We need to get you back up to speed and running that up the ladder if needed. Okay, is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
I'll just say that um, I can only think of like a couple of situations where not tracking time actually can make sense. And the first situation, it's very uncommon, is your business works in such a way where you are basically doing staffing. You hire an engineer, you deploy
Mm,
that engineer against one client, you mark them up, right? In that case, do you really need a model for time? No. I mean, it's so predictable that
yeah.
either that person's fully utilized or they're not fully utilized, right? So there are certain business models where you could legitimately get away with this. Billing models that are based on value, that are based on percent of ad spend, that are based on flat fees, that are based on flat recurring monthly retainers, that is not an excuse that absolves you of time tracking. And the reason for this is the fundamental purpose is measuring where your costs go, right? So the reason that that previous example of basically staffing makes sense is you can identify where 100% of that person's cost went. It went to this client because it's the only one that they work on. And if that client fires us, this person gets fired too,
Oh,
probably,
yeah.
right? So that makes sense. And the other situation is where you just don't care about optimizing for understanding how long it takes you to do things, resource planning things well, optimizing for profitability, in which case, fair enough, right? You can leave that money on the table. Just, it's your decision. It's deliberate. What I will say is it's getting harder and harder to get away with that in our industry because our industry is maturing. Margins are getting tighter. The level of
Yes.
sophistication you need to have on this is higher and higher. It's like, imagine, again, imagine a restaurant that didn't track their food costs, or imagine like an airline that was just very, very lax about like their maintenance costs on their airplanes. Like airlines are running at single digit profit margins annually. They can't afford to not do these things well. I think that that's where we're headed with this industry, where you just like the margins just aren't good enough for you to kind of be lackadaisy about this thing unless you're in a very, very, very good niche, or you just have these like golden geese that are shitting in your lap every week with these massive projects with crazy budgets. But that's not the case for most people. So that's all I'll kind of end with is like, this stuff is important. It's to the benefit of everyone that's involved in your agency if you do it with the right intention, if you do it the right way. And hopefully there's been some ideas here that have helped to that end.
Yeah. And I think the one thing I would just add to that is it doesn't have to be hard. I think, you've commented on that a few times. There is a tendency to overcomplicate, to stress out, to make it feel like this is now filled with consequences and tough conversations. It doesn't have to be any of that. Like if you show up with curiosity, if you show up with a good game plan, and you're ready to just get the job done, it can actually be quite simple to complete. Okay, so I know you mentioned you have something that would get down into the details. Did you want to share a little bit more about that and let people know how they can get that information from you?
Sure. I talk about this a lot. Not just time tracking, but especially all the stuff that you do with the time tracking data once you have it and how to implement
Yeah.
these systems. And I mean, I'm sure people listening to this can tell that I'm strangely passionate about this very niche subject. And so if you are in the weeds trying to figure this stuff out, we have a free toolkit. You can find it at parakeeto.com/toolkit. I'll type it in the chat here as well. That's in the private chat. I'll put it in the comments on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll go do that after the fact. I'll leave a comment with a link to that, but it's parakeeto.com/toolkit. And it's structured as a course. There's videos. They go through the metrics that you should be tracking, how to calculate them, the benchmarks for that. It includes free templates and tools to help you calculate those things. So there's like an incredible amount of stuff in there to help you start measuring the fundamentals of your business and start getting a grip on your profitability. And it's absolutely zero cost. So I want to encourage everyone to go and grab that. And, we publish lots of content on this stuff as well. So follow me on LinkedIn, follow us on our podcast. And we'd love to hear from you. And hopefully all of that is helpful.
Yeah, this has been a really great conversation. And that sounds really great and sounds like a great way to start understanding all the data that we can pull from that. So be sure to grab that. If you're looking for some quick tips on getting this implemented just from a tactical standpoint from your tool and such, if you just want to go ahead and drop the word guide in the comment, then we'll go ahead and get something over to you as well that will help you just get some basics in terms of setup started. Marcel, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much value you just dropped on everybody who's watching. This was such a fun conversation. So I just really appreciate you taking some time to spend with us.
Thank you for having me, Melissa. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you.
Okay, great.